Welcome to the Organisational Inclusionist. I'm your host, Grace Mosuro. In this podcast series, we'll be delving deep into the pressing issues surrounding equality, diversity, and inclusion in both the workplace and the broader world. My goal is to foster understanding, inspire change, and amplify the voices of those advocating for a more inclusive and equitable society. Throughout this series, I'll be engaging in candid discussions with leaders, experts, activists, and changemakers from various fields. We'll explore the challenges, successes, and evolving landscapes of equality, diversity, and inclusion. From dismantling systematic biases to promoting equal opportunities for all, we'll touch on a broad range of topics. But we won't stop at discussing problems. We'll actively seek out solutions and actionable steps to drive positive change. Our aim is to inspire and empower you, our listeners, to take an active role in making the world a better place for everyone. This is the Organisational Inclusionist. Let's get started. Welcome to this episode of the Organisational Inclusionist. Today I'm joined by the wonderful Dr. Nena Foster, and we're going to be discussing burnout and the relationship it has to inclusion. So how does inclusion play a part in burnout, and what should organisations be looking at and doing to support their employees to prevent that? But before we get stuck into our conversation, Nena, I would love it if you could please give our listeners a bit of an intro into who you are and your background, please.
Yes, so a bit about me. I think it's often like it's kind of can be long-winded, but I'll give you the very short. So essentially, I am a diversity and wellbeing consultant. I run my own consultancy and work as an associate in other consultancies. I have a background in DEI, background in health and wellbeing. As well as being a consultant, I'm a trained sort of nutritional coach and holistic wellness coach. And I, up until quite recently, was working specifically as a DEI consultant. I was director of a consultancy firm, specifically working around inclusion. But have decided to make a step my own venture where I pulled my work that feel most important to me, and that's around inclusion and wellness and well-being. And these are areas that professionally I'm very passionate about. Personally, I'm very passionate about. And I think I'm at the stage of my career now where I'm just really leaning into what really feels good to be working in and working on. And so I have founded my own consultancy called Circle, a Wellness and Inclusion. And that really focuses on helping support organizations to think about inclusion and the overlap between inclusion and well-being, and how to address those strategically, and solve for the problems that your organization actually have around these issues, rather than kind of just band-aiding or spot solutioning. And I think the real aim is to help organizations really start to think more strategically about these areas, and also more holistically, because as we'll talk about in a minute, it's all interconnected. And there's so many aspects of well-being that are impacted by inclusion that it's really important to be taking notice of them in a bigger picture way. So,
Absolutely. I absolutely love what you do. Could you give our listeners just some examples about maybe the types of interventions that you provide organizations?
Working on with organizations is, again, strategy. So thinking strategically about these two areas, where the overlaps are, where the challenges are specifically in their organization, and then how to solutionize for those problems. And those solutionizing can be helping to provide specific focused learning and development. And that's kind of where I think a lot of the solutions sit. So it's helping to develop kind of, as an organizational culture, how do you build in and address the kind of challenges your organization faces around these issues? But also, how do you provide individuals with the knowledge and resources to support their own well-being, and how to challenge, when things don't feel inclusive. So providing them with the skills and the capabilities to do that themselves. So really, it is about trying to think more strategically, more holistically, and providing organizations and people with the space to kind of look at the wider culture, but also to think about how we resource individuals within organizations to do these things better and more effectively and more impactfully.
Amazing. Yeah. I feel like only recently have we started to hear the talk and the conversation about the link or the overlap between burnout and inclusion. So for anyone that's new to, them even having a relationship, what would you say the link is?
Talking about diversity and inclusion for quite a while, and well-being, and I think those areas have kind of run tangentially. And it's interesting when I think about the kind of trajectory within organizations around DEI and around well-being, the trajectory has been very similar. It's kind of the stuff that we're kind of dipping our toe in, we're trying to do a bit of, we're not really sure if it's working, but in some cases we're doing it anyhow. And we don't really think about how they can work together. And I think when we talk about And I think often I want to like focus a part of the DEI discussion around inclusion specifically, because I think diversity, we've had lots of discussions there and we kind of really know what we need to be doing there. But I think in order to create real inclusion, I think that's where we're all still kind of really grappling. So I think when we look at inclusion and what we need, and individuals need and organizations need to be inclusive, we're talking about things like, ensuring that people belong, people feel a sense of control, people feel a sense of general kind of fairness within their organizations, and that they can trust their organizations are doing the right thing for them. They feel like it's a place where their values are honored and aligned with the values of the organization. So when we're talking about inclusion, that's the sort of stuff we're talking about. And when we're talking about well-being, we know the absence of those sorts of things are what lead to poor mental, physical health, and also what lead to, and what are some of the most like important signs for burnout. So when you're working in a way where you don't have a control over your workload, where your things are constantly changing and you don't know why, and you've got leaders or managers who are micromanaging you, we know those situations lead to that lack of autonomy, that lack of control. And there's swathes of research that shows that those are the key sort of the ripe or the fertile conditions for creating situations of burnout. So I think when we're talking about inclusion, we're looking at those concepts, but when we're also talking about well-being and burnout, we're looking at the same concepts. And I think really it's about creating a culture that takes that all into account. And so again, in an inclusive culture, you will have people that are able to work in a way that feels good for them, where their values feel aligned, that honors their boundaries around what they can and can't do, that gives them space to look after themselves, to prioritize their own well-being in a way that's important to them. And again, that those are the conditions in which we see people thriving rather than burning out.
Definitely. I think it's interesting as well, because usually when we refer to inclusion, people think that it's just in reference to marginalized groups, but inclusion is about your entire workforce, right? So how do you make everyone in your workforce feel like they belong and feel like they they can see themselves in the organization? What
Yeah.
impact would you say, because I think it's really important to get across that actually a lack of inclusion impacts everyone. So what impact would you say I think we get, but it would be good to hear from you as well, is the impact that a lack of inclusion in organizations can have on marginalized communities as well as those from dominant cultures, so white
Yeah.
colleagues in the workplace.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when we're talking about, the situations that lead to burnout for marginalized colleagues or marginalized groups within organizations, we also have to take into account the additional kind of burden and tax that people from those groups face. So things like microaggressions, the kinds of continued anxieties around trust and performance. And those are the kind of like added pressures that people from marginalized groups carry and bring to work with them and operate underneath all the stuff they need to do every day to get on with their work. And that can take its toll. And I think, for a lot of people, and obviously I am one of those people, I'm a person from, a Black background in a workplace, having had a senior role, when you don't feel that you are a part of the fabric of an organization and that you are included, you're working extra hours to prove yourself, to be the best at what you do, so that people can't fault your level of competence. So you're often putting more into doing the role, and that takes its toll again on you physically, emotionally. But again, those are the things that we see continually leading to situations of burnout. So I think that people from marginalized groups are probably more prone to burnout. I mean, there's been lots of research looking at things like, Black female nurses, Black female social workers, and the rates of kind of burnout amongst those populations are quite high because of this added level of, sort of stereotyping, microaggressions, the added burden of operating in a systemically unfair system, and having to deal with all that on top of the day-to-day of the work, and depending on the type of the work, the emotional toll or tax that comes along with that as well.
And then for white colleagues in the workplace, how does a lack of inclusion impact them?
How does sorry, I missed that, lack of autonomy, you said?
Inclusion in the organization.
Inclusion, sorry. Yes, I think obviously we're all individuals with our own individual sort of set of needs, wants, prescriptions, and we all want to come to a place where we feel that we can do our best and be our best. And I think, like any person in the workplace, whether you're from a marginalized or a global majority group, you are, you want to come to work and be able to have those conditions in which you can thrive. So I don't think, when we talk about inclusion, we are necessarily needing to separate out, white colleagues from black colleagues, or marginalized colleagues from non-marginalized colleagues, because we want to be creating a space for everyone to feel like they can thrive and be included. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that for certain groups of people, there's an added layer, an added level of consideration we need to understand, and to account for in order for that to really happen.
Mm.
Yeah.
I always think, because obviously when in this inclusion work and in the work that we do for a living in equality, diversity, and
Hmm.
inclusion, there is always some pushback from people that feel like actually, these policies don't apply to them and therefore they feel excluded. But
Hmm.
also on the flip side of that, there's also active allies in the workplace who don't identify as being
Hmm.
from marginalized groups, but work in
Hmm.
environments that maybe aren't as inclusive as they could be. And the impact
Hmm.
that has on their colleagues from marginalized backgrounds then rubs off onto them, because they're coming to a workplace where their friends or their colleagues aren't happy or are
Hmm.
burning out. And the
Hmm.
subsequent impact that can then have on their well-being is quite
Hmm.
significant as well. So I think it's
Hmm.
just really important for organizations to be conscious of that, is that actually in supporting, or in creating inclusion, you are doing it for everyone. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily
Hmm.
just about the marginalized groups, even though
No.
there is a gap
Yeah.
that we're trying to close in that area. Actually, there is a significant benefit for everyone in that. And I think that's so powerful
Yeah.
and so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you cannot have inclusion without that being built and baked into your culture. I mean, you
Mm.
have to create a culture within an organization that prioritizes inclusion, that prioritizes well-being. And and I think obviously everybody in an organization has a role in creating and shaping and
Mm.
perpetuating a culture. So obviously we think a lot of culture sort of direction comes from the top of the organization, which very much does. The leadership in the organization sets and steers the direction, but the way in which we operate in a day-to-day setting, and in terms of how those day-to-day interactions impact on our overarching culture, we all play a role in that. And
Mm.
I think if we can bake inclusion and well-being into that culture, then of course everybody benefits. No one is
Exactly.
disbenefiting from having and being in a being in a space where the conditions are so good that you want to come to work and you thrive, and do well, and you're healthy, and well balanced, well adjusted. I mean, yes, I mean, it does sound quite idealistic, but I guess creating an environment where that feels possible for everyone is completely, yeah, no one loses. No one loses when you have
Exactly.
that sort of culture.
How do wellness programs help?
So there's lots of evidence now looking at, kind of what existing well-being offerings are doing. Whether it's like the kind of, the apps or the gym memberships, and I think a lot of the evidence is showing us that a lot of that stuff isn't actually making any impact. And I think one of the reasons is organizations are not solving for the problems that exist in their organization. They're kind of taking a stab in the dark, going, it would be nice if we offered these things. But again, that's not necessarily inclusive, because you're not taking into account, the breadth and depth of needs in your organization.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't know, but maybe and that's part of the problem. You don't know, but that's also what you need to know in order to create well-being programs that actually work. Like, what are the actual challenges in our organization? What do people actually need? Um, and then solving for that. But I think a lot of well-being programs need to, I guess, again, work on that wider culture piece. Kind of, as I said, embedding and baking in a culture of well-being. So, for example, where you have organizations where the kind of culture is to, give 110%, work all hours, be on call, that complete kind of lack of control and autonomy. When that's baked into your culture, that is not a culture right for wellness and well-being. It might work for some people, but it's not going to work for everyone. And again, it's not inclusive, it's not sustainable, it's not the type of culture where everyone can thrive.
Mm.
Some people perhaps, but not everyone. So I think it's looking at the culture and understanding how your culture is structured to facilitate that. And then again, as I said, understanding where the challenges are and solutionizing for those. But I think there's also a part of giving individuals the resources they need to support their well-being. And giving them the knowledge really of how to do that. So I think a lot of the work that I've done with organizations around this is helping to provide education sessions on things like nutrition. Everybody eats. Everybody needs to have a basic understanding of nutrition and how to feed themselves well. And no matter who you are, what culture you come from, there's a way of eating in a way that supports your well-being. So helping people learn about how to do that, how to take a more conscious approach to what they're eating, and understanding how that impacts on their well-being. So giving them a basic level of knowledge and understanding to help them look after and support their own well-being, I think, is important too. But I think definitely we know that the workplace provides a really ripe opportunity for supporting or hindering people's well-being. And I think organizations need to take responsibility for that by understanding how their culture is contributing or hindering to well-being.
Absolutely. You mentioned well-being programs that organizations have and
Mm-hmm.
them not necessarily hitting the mark. But one of the
Mm-hmm.
challenges that I know a number of organizations have is a lack of uptake of the benefits that they offer,
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
around well-being. What would your advice be to organizations struggling with that in terms of
Yeah.
creating these schemes that
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
cater to the
Yeah.
needs of wide groups?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it just squiffs exactly what I've said. It's like, it's because you don't know what people want or what people need. You haven't actually maybe asked the question. You haven't given people the space and the license to consider what it is they need to be well. And again, that will be very different. Some people, yes, a gym membership might be great. Some people might just actually want to have an hour off in the day to have a nap. I don't know. I mean, and this is the thing. I think organizations aren't asking these questions, and they aren't getting to the root of the problem, and just kind of, again, and I guess in some ways, I know they're expensive, so it's not easy in that respect. It's easy to offer blanketed benefits, but it's not actually, and we see that it's not hitting the mark. People aren't taking them up. I'm working with a charity at the moment who are trying to understand, again, like, where do we spend our money? How do we prioritize well-being, because they've got an app, and I was chatting to the CEO, and he was saying, well, actually, like, I think there's only 2 of us in the entire organization who've ever used this app, and we're paying out as a charity, a small charity, 10
Mm.
grand a year for this app,
Yeah.
and no one's using it. And so this is not an uncommon, I think, experience where organizations are paying large sums of money for things that people just aren't used because it's not what they want, it's not what they
Mm.
need. And I think it's important to offer something, but I think if you're not offering the right thing, you're wasting your time and money, and you're not solving the problem. So I think what some of the work I do with organizations is to take that step back to help them understand what it is their people need. And sometimes people need the space to work out what it is they need to be
Mm.
well. So I run a session on, and this kind of harkens to my kind of well-being coaching background, where I kind of group coach people to sit down and think about what do they need to be well, like, what are their priorities, what is their kind of vision for, like, being in their best health and being their best self. And that can be, again, very different. I've had people who say, I want to be a 90-year-old potter, and, like, I want to have a great shed where I'm, like, have my friends around and make pottery up until I'm, like, not able to move my hands anymore. And that for them is well-being. Whereas for somebody else it might be being able to stay physically active until old age. So it really varies, and I think people need the space to work out what it is they need, but also organizations need to ask this question so they can help facilitate that. Because we know, again, when we have people who are happy, healthy, well, organizations benefit from that. So I think
Absolutely.
it's to every organization's benefit to ask the questions, what do you need to be well, to help provide those resources, to help foster a culture within the organization that supports that, because ultimately both, well, organizations benefit, but also individuals benefit. And when you can get the best out of your people, when they're their best, you're your best. So
Mm.
I think, yeah.
Know of anyone that's got it right, that's got the balance right. They understand or have
Mm,
created a culture that is inclusive and their employees are
mm.
really, really happy.
I dare not say yes or no. I think for everyone, this is a journey. And I think with most things like this, it's never going to be once and done. I mean, your organization, your people are your organization. And as those people change, as their life stages change, this is going to change. So I don't feel like, I don't necessarily know who's got it, who's sailing through this. And I don't necessarily think and want to give the impression that once you crack it, It's going to work for 10 years because it's going to change as your people change, as
Absolutely.
as the working world, as the world around us changes. I mean, obviously, post COVID, we all need something a little bit different than we probably needed pre-COVID, even though that was just a few years. So I think it is about organizations being more proactive, more I think and more open to asking these questions and unearthing the challenges and unearthing what it is people need and being responsive to that. Yeah.
And what can we as individuals in our workplaces do to impact all of this?
We help collectively to shape our organization's culture. So wherever you are in an organization, being mindful of the role you play in setting a culture of inclusion and well-being. Again, wherever you are in the organization, being open about what it is you need, but also being able to provide those spaces and listening to what it is people need. So, if you're a leader in an organization, you need to be asking these questions, you need to be receptive to the answers, and you need to be thinking about, how is this an important line of our business, thinking about it as a part of your business and not just as an add-on to what you do. And as I said, when I think about, where we were with DEI conversations, we've been saying this for years, like it's not an add-on, it's a part of your business. And I think we can make the same argument for well-being. This is not an add-on, it's a part of your business, because it's not just like, sickness and absence. It's also like, burnout. It's also all the things that might cost your business money if you don't actually take notice of and address appropriately. So I think, it's being mindful of all the role that we all play. It's, if you are a leader in an organization, being receptive to those, to asking those questions, to responding to, those different needs, and thinking again more strategically about how you address them, and not just thinking about another sticking plaster, another gym membership, a fruit bowl, those sorts of things. Like, I think those things will probably be amongst some of the things that you might offer to people in your organization, but that can't be all you do. And you can't expect those things to fit the needs and meet the needs of everyone, because they're not going to. So I think, not to completely dismiss, office yoga, but again, that's not going to be something that everyone can take advantage of. Again, if we're thinking about from, a disability point of view, like, if you're offering yoga yoga on Thursdays, then, how inclusive is that? Like, is there something for people who perhaps have limited mobility, or perhaps who, again, just maybe don't like yoga? I don't know. But yeah, so I think it's really about thinking more critically and strategically about this, and not just sticking plasters and not just add-ons, because this is a core part of your business, like making profits are. So yeah.
So if I'm a representative of an organization, I'm listening to this podcast, I'm hearing all your advice, and I think actually we need to revisit our wellness approach in the organization to create inclusion.
Yeah.
Where should I start?
Looking at, because I mean, obviously organizations will be doing some of this, running again tangentially. It's kind of looking at what you're doing, first of all, and thinking about and, pulling together some resources to understand what you're doing. Is it working? Why is it not working? Going to your people, understanding where the challenges are. And again, being more strategic about how you then address those challenges. So thinking through, okay, right, if we understand this to be the problem, how do we develop a solution to that problem? And I think, so starting with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How do we strategically address this problem? And what do the solutions need to look like? And again, that whole process has to be one where you're thinking about the elements of, inclusion. Who are the people in your business and what do they need? Their needs will differ. So how do we factor that into whatever it is we do? And then I guess as well, it's about, and this is, I think, where a lot of DEI has gone wrong, and I think potentially we have the same pitfalls in thinking about, well-being and inclusion, is then how do we then know if it's working? Like, again, and if you're thinking strategically about this, like you would many other your business challenges or operational challenges, you're going to want to build in like the markers or measures for success. So what are they? How do you know if what you're doing is working? And how can you build in those ways to help you gather that evidence? Because I think that's important for a number of reasons. But And I think that's probably where a lot of organizations do go wrong with initiatives generally, is not really measuring or knowing how to measure whether or not it's working. And engaging in that cycle and process of knowing it's not once and done. So this will be something that, again, like you would any sort of strategy, 2 years, 3 years, however long you want to think, you put this sort of strategy in place for, you're going to have to come back to it and revisit it as your organization changes, as your people change, as the world around us.
Thank you so much for
No, thank you.
What you've shared. I think, a lot of what you've said feels like common sense, but we are so busy in the day-to-day, Nena, that we just don't get the time sometimes to sit down and revisit this and really look at it. And I think that's where, there is benefit in contacting people like yourself for that support and that guidance, because sometimes you do need that external view to support you to really drive that change in your organization. So I just want to say a massive, massive thank you for joining me today and for sharing what you've shared, because I know it's going to add a lot of value to organizations, particularly those that have come into the new year with, big plans around how they approach wellness in their organizations, how they approach inclusivity. I think people are going to take away a lot from that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This podcast is brought to you by Acquaintance Consulting. We'd love it if you could take a minute at the end of this podcast to follow, subscribe, whichever is easier or available for you on the platform that you're listening to us on. We're really keen to grow this channel and really impact equality, diversity and inclusion across the world. And with your support, we can do just that.